Hello, and welcome to the Diane Rehm Book Club. I am Leslie Van Sant, Chief Advancement Officer at WAMU. Thank you so much for joining us today. WAMU's mission is to connect listeners and members like you to each other and the world. We proudly offer you this opportunity to be curious and explore relationships via the Diane Rehm Book Club. A little housekeeping first to assist your participation today. If you'd like to ask a question, please do so using the Q&A function found at the bottom of your Zoom screen. If you'd like to access closed captioning, please click on the CC button, also found on the bottom of your Zoom screen. Like everything we do at WAMU, this book club would not be possible without your support. If you enjoy today's discussion, please consider making a gift online by visiting dianerehm.org/give. Now, please join me in welcoming my friend and colleague, Diane Rehm.
And thank you so much, Leslie, for that introduction. I must say we are so pleased to have Michael Crummey join us today to talk about his latest novel, The Adversary. It tells the story of a brother and sister's feud in 18th century Newfoundland. Their battle for power in the tiny town of Mockbeggar spirals into vendettas and violence. With unforgettable characters and a fair share of humor, the novel holds a mirror up to our modern politics of grievance and retribution. Michael Crummey is an award-winning and best-selling author. He lives in Newfoundland. His work includes 7 books of poetry and 6 novels. And Michael, I am absolutely delighted to have you with us today. Thank you so much for joining us.
I'm thrilled to be here. It's great to talk to you again.
And tell me, Michael, where this novel comes from. I must say, it is dark in so many places. It has such dark characters, but I gather it comes from a totally different kind of place.
Yeah, it's difficult to talk about the origin of this novel without talking about the novel I wrote before this one. So I apologize for doing that for people who haven't read that book.
That's fine.
But I wrote a book called The Innocents, and which was based very loosely on a true story. It was just a little paragraph long thing I found in the archives here in Newfoundland. And it was a clergyman who was traveling around Newfoundland. This was so far back that most communities didn't have their own churches, so the clergy traveled. And in the course of his travels, he came into a tiny cove and found an orphaned brother and sister living alone there. And he quickly sussed out that the sister was pregnant and automatically assumed, I'm sure quite rightly, that the brother was the father. And that was really that was everything that was there, except that, of course, the clergyman got on his high horse and the brother ended up driving him out of the cove with a rifle. So, but there was no other information about the youngsters than that. And my first thought when I read that was, oh, there's a story there. And my second thought was, I'm not touching that with a 10-foot pole. Like, I wanted no part of it whatsoever. And so I put that, I didn't make a note of it. I just put it back wherever I found it. And then proceeded to try and forget it. And those kids haunted me for a long time. Just, I think because I thought of them in the context of my own childhood, where I grew up in a world where we had sex education in the class. When I was almost 13, my mother forced me to read a book called Almost 13. and then asked if I had any questions. I had no questions, by the way. But there were places for a child at that time in the world to turn to for answers for the really distressing, strange questions that were coming up. And despite that, it was still in many ways the most confusing, and in some ways the loneliest time of my life,
Really?
like all of my friends were going through the same thing, but it felt like we were all going through it alone.
You
And
didn't talk with each other about it.
yeah, and not in any way that was helpful.
Huh.
And not in any way that really answered questions about why this was happening and what it meant for us as like young adults. And I always imagined those two kids as having been orphaned before they hit puberty, and thinking not only would they have no one to talk to about this when they hit puberty, but they wouldn't even have a language that allowed them to talk about it. So I ended up writing a novel that I hoped did the exact opposite of what that clergyman did. I wanted to write a book that explained how they found themselves in that circumstance without judging them for finding themselves in that circumstance. And although there is a sexual relationship between the brother and sister in the book, that's only one thing that happens to them in a long period of trying to survive in incredibly difficult circumstances. And the thing that allows them to survive ultimately is their love for one another. That their first concern always was the welfare of the person they're with. And even when they don't like each other particularly in the novel, they love each other absolutely. And that is kind of the animating principle of that book.
And so in this book, you
This,
go in absolutely the opposite way.
yeah, and it feels a little bit accidental. Because the last book was called The Innocents, I started thinking a lot about William Blake's lyric sequences, the Songs of Innocence and the Songs of Experience. I don't know if you're familiar with them. They're two long sequences of very short lyric poems. Songs of Innocence he wrote first, and it's really about the beauty of childhood and the innocence of childhood. And then he wrote this sequence called Songs of Experience, in which he flips that world on its head. And so a lot of the same circumstances exist. So there are lambs and children and people in churches, but in Songs of Experience, the lambs, instead of frolicking in the fields, are being taken to the slaughterhouse, and the children, instead of playing together, are hungry and in poverty on the streets. And he said he was attempting to show, I don't know if I'll get this right, he was attempting to show the two contrary states of the human soul. And I started thinking it might be interesting to try to write a companion book to The Innocents. So it's not a sequel. You don't need to know anything about The Innocents to read this book. But it was my attempt to turn that world on its head. And so where The Innocents was kind of a twisted Adam and Eve story, this book is very much a Cain and Abel story.
Now, Michael, there is a passage in your book that I'd like you to read for us, because that sets up the way this brother and sister behave toward each other. And therefrom comes this horrible, competitive, angry, ugly relationship. Would you read that for us?
Sure. This is from early on in the book, and it's a reflection back to a time when the widow Keynes. So the sister is known only as the widow, or the widow Keynes, in this book. But as a young teenager, she is forced by her father to become her brother's tutor.
And her brother's name is
Abe Strap. Her brother was raised by servants instructed to indulge his every whim. He was wet nursed by a young mother and insisted on taking the teat until he was 4 years old, when the woman finally refused to carry on. For months afterward, he grabbed at the servants' breasts, trying to haul down their aprons and blouses to suckle, sending the house up with a tantrum when they fended him off. He'd never taken much to table manners or even to wearing stockings or trousers. He'd been sent to school with other children his age, but he would not sit still for 2 minutes at a time and chased the girls around the schoolhouse, holding his bald cock like a pistol and squealing as he tried to piss on their skirts and shoes. Even though her salary was paid by Abe's father, Cornelius Strapp, the teacher refused to hold classes with Abe in attendance, and eventually he was kept home. He had no interest in any bookish undertaking or instruction. The only discipline he respected was his sister's sketching, which he looked upon as a kind of magic that he demanded to be taught. The infantile and cockeyed figures he could manage infuriated the boy. He despised his sister for holding the talent to herself, as if she'd stolen something that rightfully belonged to him, and he defaced her sketches with charcoal scrawls or burnt them in the fireplace. She retaliated by holding him by the ear and driving the alphabet into his head as if she was hammering nails through a board. They each saw in the other the antithesis and obstacle of all they valued and wanted from the world.
The writing in your book is so vivid and so beautiful that I really have to congratulate you and say that on another basis, his father, Cornelius, seems to be the absolute antithesis of the son he produced. It's as though he gave him everything to try to help him become a good man as he was. And he turned out to be exactly the opposite.
Yeah. Well, Cornelius, of course, is a merchant in this town. And he is somebody who has, like his daughter, a kind of preternatural ability for making money. He is able to see the opportunity for making money in just about any circumstance. And he's not miserly about it, and he's not mean-spirited about it, but that's a skill that he has. As a father, he has no clue. No idea what is needed to raise a child. And there's a certain point in the book where he admits that to the beadle, that
The beadle being
his head man, who sort of runs the day-to-day operations of the business, but is also appointed in the church as kind of a lay person. The reverend in this community died 20 years before the novel starts, and they've never been able to talk anyone else into coming to take over the church. So the beadle has become kind of the spiritual leader of the community as well. But he admits to the beadle that it's beyond his capacity to figure out how to help his son be a man in the world. And Abe, of course, his mother dies in childbirth and is let loose in the world with no direction whatsoever, other than an occasional beating, which only makes things worse in the end.
So the book opens with a 14-year-old girl being brought across the ocean, sick as a dog, being taken across the ocean. Her father has decided that if he can marry his daughter to Abe Strapp, they will both be very comfortably wealthy, especially if they join forces. Of course, The 14-year-old has no idea why she's taking this trip with her father until he walks her into the church. They look around and there is no groom present.
Right.
And where is Abe strapped?
Well, Abe eventually is tracked down by a couple of his handlers and is brought to the church completely stinking drunk, of course. And to Abe, the wedding is it's something that the beadle has suggested to his father before his father's very sick and about to die. And the beadle suggests if he makes it a condition of the will that his son has to marry before he gets his inheritance, then that might somehow influence him in his way of seeing his responsibilities in the world. Abe, of course, is totally against that idea at first until the beadle points out to him, if he marries the daughter of this other merchant, he will stand to inherit all of that as well. So Abe is somebody whose every relationship in the novel is transactional. His only way of looking at the world is, what can I get from this relationship? What can I get from this person? What can I get from this institution? And as it turns out, the widow is a much more interesting character in many ways. She's much more intelligent than Abe, for one. I mean, Abe's only skill in the world, outside of trouble, is that he knows how to mess with people. He knows how to get into people's heads in a way that serves his purposes. The widow is much more. Abe is all appetite, and the widow is all will. And she's born into a world, of course, that's completely unfair to her because of her gender. And it takes an incredible amount of gumption and skill and wit for her to make her way in the world as she wants. But as it turns out, as the novel goes on, I think it becomes clear that the only way in which that brother and sister are alike is in this one sense, and that is that every relationship they have is transactional. That all they want is what they can get from the people and institutions around them.
Let's talk about the title of your book. I must say, there are so many words in this book that I did not recognize. So I kept my cell phone beside me as I was reading and looked up every single word, and then discovered that you had found a way to use the words of the time by another book, and that book was?
Well, there were two main ones, and the first one is the Dictionary of Newfoundland English, which I've used in every book I've ever written, which is it's one of my desert island books. It's a compendium of all the ways that Newfoundlanders have adapted and added to the English language to fit the world that they found themselves living in. But when I was writing The Innocents, I realized that it was so far back that Ada and Everett, the brother and sister, were Newfoundlanders, born and raised there. But most of the characters that showed up in that book were Europeans. So I went looking for something that would tell me how English people spoke in the late 18th century. And I happened upon the Dictionary of the Vulgar Tongue, written by compiled by a man named Francis Gross. I think first published in the 1780s or 1790s. And at the time, vulgar just meant common. So it was how common people spoke. So how people spoke on the street and on the docks and in the bars and in the brothels and other places. So as it turned out, there was quite a bit of vulgarity included in the Dictionary of the Vulgar Tongue. And again, like the Dictionary of Newfoundland English, it was so entertaining just to read that book.
Absolutely.
just the way that people use the language to insult one another, to talk about the world that they lived in. So I went out of my way to use as much of that language as I could possibly get books. Partly because I felt like the language was incredibly beautiful and entertaining, but also as a way of giving a reader a sense of how people actually spoke to one another.
Indeed, indeed. And it was both clever and annoying because I kept having to look words up, but I learned in the process.
Well, and I also hope that what I try to do when I'm using language that I know most people won't be familiar with is as much as possible to present it in a context where even if you don't know what the word means, you can get the
Yeah.
gist of the character saying.
Right,
From
right.
there's one scene in the book where when Abe has he's gone to St. John's and he's recruited a group of prostitutes to bring to Mockbeggar to set up his own brothel, and they're in his childhood home, which he's turning into a brothel. And the madam asks how many bedrooms are upstairs, and he says, well, there are 3, but there's also the servants' room at the back near the kitchen. And she says, oh, the servants' room, I guess that's seen its share of the old art of basket making, which Abe doesn't understand. So she tries another euphemism for sexual intercourse. And then she goes through this whole list of euphemisms for sexual intercourse until she hits one that Abe understands. And the only reason that scene is in the book is because I wanted to list all of the euphemisms that I had found in this dictionary, and just to make sure that I got them all in there.
I want to go back to the title of the book because that too, the adversary sort of means someone who is opposed, someone who perhaps has a very different view, but it can also, without the preposition in front of it, can stand for Satan.
Mm-hmm.
So that we indeed have a story where 2 people are so hateful of each other that their hatred spreads across the country, as some say the devil or Satan can also manage to do. Was that your deliberation in thinking about the title?
Well, I was thinking, I did like the biblical resonance that the adversary has, this sense that there is an opponent in the world that is interested in taking us down in one way or another. It's clear that for Abe and for the widow, they see each other as the adversary in their lives. But in many ways, both Abe and the widow do not change throughout the entire length of the book. They're the same people at the beginning of the book as they are at the end, which is a bit of a challenge for a writer. So in some ways, what I was interested in was how the people around those 2 people respond to their hatred for each other. How do they align themselves with one or the other, and why? And what does it do to them to take sides in that kind of a dispute? And some people do it for self-benefit. Some people do it because they feel like they have no choice. Some people, like Solemn, for example, I feel like this is a young boy whose father was killed by Abe, and he takes sides because of what he feels is right in his heart. But for all of those people, it ends up being a very destructive thing to align themselves with somebody who has only the worst, has only the worst motivations at heart. And in some ways, I think I was thinking about the world we're living in now,
Exactly.
where it does feel like there are very clearly people in positions of power with no moral standing whatsoever, who clearly are in it for themselves. And my question always is, I understand that. I know there are people like that in the world. The mystery for me has always been, why do the people around them make the decisions that they make to support and protect and defend that person or those people? And I think that ultimately that's a really destructive thing. And the adversary for each of the people in this novel, in the end, is themselves. It's their own heart. It's what they want for themselves that ends up being the thing that is most dangerous to them, and ultimately the thing that leads to, in some cases, to their destruction, complete
And
destruction.
you're not talking just about adults, you're talking about children as well. I'm fascinated with why the widow has chosen that green jacket. Tell me about that green jacket and why she, who bought the jacket for her husband, who ultimately dies at the earliest of the book, she bought it for him, but he says, no, I'm not going to wear that. He did. He put it on once, but then after he dies, she wears the jacket to his funeral, and from then on, she is only seen in public wearing that green jacket. I can see that green jacket. Tell me why that's so important.
Yeah, well, it's interesting. I mean, as I said, this is kind of a companion book to The Innocents. And in some ways, I thought of it as a mirror image of that book. And in The Innocents, Ada ends up wearing men's clothes. In complete innocence, her and her brother they're wearing rags, and they happen upon a shipwreck and a trunk full of clothes. And the men's clothes is just more practical in the world that she's living in. And it doesn't mean anything to her other than this is more comfortable and this is what I'm going to wear. But I knew when I started this book as a mirror image, the sister was going to be wearing men's clothes. And uh, and so I had to find a way for her to be dressed in men's clothes. And in the novel, there's a small community of Quakers in Mockbeggar. And I didn't know this until I started doing research for the novel, but there was a small community of Quakers in Newfoundland at the time. Uh, and of course, she buys the suit as a gift for her husband when they're getting married. And he puts it on one time, and it's, as she says, it's the height of fashion. So it's a dragon green jacket, a striped waistcoat with 2 watch chains. And her husband has worn, as the novel says, the same suit of ditto for 25 years. And the Quakers, as part of their beliefs, would not draw attention to themselves with what they wore, with jewelry, with anything of that sort. So he tries it on, but he can't bring himself to wear it. And so it goes in the closet until he dies. And that's when the widow becomes kind of the sole owner of a woman had no right to property at the time, unless she was the widow of a man without descendants. And the widow puts herself in a position to be the widow of a man without descendants. She owns this merchant trading company, and she shows up at the funeral wearing his clothes. And in her case, the wearing of the male costume is a statement to the world
Mm.
of how she's going to live her life in that in that community and what people are to expect of her in her position as owner of that business.
One of our listeners, Sarah, asks, she says, you write a lot about the Quakers and the Church of England. What were you trying to say about religion?
Well, I was trying to give a true portrait of the communities in that part of Newfoundland at that time. So a lot of what happens in this book is based on, to a certain extent, the history of a community called Bonavista. And a small part of that community was called Mockbeggar. And at the time, there was a Church of England and there were Quakers. So part of, as a writer, what you do is you take what the world gives you and then you try to create a story out of it. I mean, it was such a gift to me to discover that there were Quakers living in Newfoundland at the time, which is something I'd never heard of. And of course, the Quaker community allowed women a freedom of speech and thought and participation.
Yes.
So far beyond what any other religion allowed, that of course for the widow, especially after her father gives the business to her ne'er-do-well brother, that's a place where she feels like she can have more of a say about her own life. So I wasn't trying to say anything, I think, in particular about either of those faiths. I do think that I do see religion as another form, another institution where power resides. And that when the wrong people have control of those institutions, when people who are only interested in transactional relationships are in positions of power, the church can be used in the same way that money or the law can be used.
Indeed. Another question is from Gabrielle. Why does Widow Kane's aged sister have no first name?
I get that question a lot. And there's one reason, and it was a very practical one. This is a Cain and Abel story. And I wanted to focus on the fact that her last name when she marries is Kane's. And I thought if I give her a first name, people will start thinking of her as that instead of with the name Kane's. So it was just a completely practical, writerly, how do I point in this direction as opposed to that direction kind
So
of
it
thing.
really is a biblical story, almost a warning story to all of us, not only about what happened back then in the 1800s, but what is happening now.
Absolutely. I mean, this book is historical fiction, but for me personally, and I don't think a reader needs to see this, but for me personally, it was about the overwhelming sense of fear and dread and anxiety that the world we're living in today has sort of dumped on all of our shoulders, you know? And I've been watching the move toward fascism and authoritarianism across the world recently, as most of us have. And so in this book, what I decided, it's an odd thing for a writer to say, but I decided I was not going to allow myself to interfere with the story. I was going to set up what felt to me like the dynamics that we're starting to see be set up in countries around the world, where the people in positions of power are not interested in the welfare of other people. They're only interested in their own, getting and maintaining their own power. And I decided I would let those dynamics play out, as I think they will if they're not stopped in the world, you know? What happens in a community where the worst of us are in positions of power and nothing is done to change that. And for me, the answer was the adversary. That was my sense of how that goes, which is why I guess it is as dark as it is.
And that is a question from David, who says, this is the bleakest novel I've read since Jude the Obscure. Is this the darkest thing you've written?
Yes, definitely. And I have been accused on a number of occasions of writing very bleak books. But in everything that I've written before now, I've always been interested in digging for and finding the humanity at the heart of the characters, even the most compromised characters, and looking for a way to show the humanity of those people and to find some light in the darkness. But as I said with this book, I had to make a pact with myself that I was not going to do that this time, that I was not going to protect the characters I loved from the awful things that were going to happen to them, because I feel like there are circumstances in this world where people don't get that protection, where they're put on a raft and left to sink or swim, and I was adamant that this book was not going to pull any punches, because I feel like we are at a tipping point in the world. I do feel like since the end of the Second World War, this is the first time, I think, where the question of, are we going to be living in democratic countries, or are we going to be living in authoritarian fascist countries, has come to the West. That was not something that the United States or Canada or England or France.
I have imagined.
And now I think it's very much the only issue outside of climate change, which is the other existential thing we're facing. So I think like the coming presidential election in the US is a question of democracy or fascism, authoritarianism. I think in Canada, to a lesser extent, just because we're a smaller country with less power, we're facing a situation where the main opposition party is a climate denying, anti-vaccine, conspiracy theory ridden, not very interested in democracy unless it puts them in power kind of party. Like just something that would have been unrecognizable 10 years ago, 15 years ago. So this book was my kind of dark night of the soul, I guess, in dealing with that and in sort of getting on paper what I was seeing in the world and living with myself.
Talk, if you would, about two of the more innocent children in the book, Solomon, whose original name was Solomon, but his sister Bride could not pronounce that. Originally, they are both caring for their dying mother, but it is Solomon's father who is killed by Abe.
Yeah.
How they come to work for the widow, both of them. And yet, when Solomon is invited to come to her home to work for him, Bride says to him, you should not come. Talk about the two of them and their very close relationship.
Yeah. I mean, so the brother and sister are kind of loom over this entire book from start to finish. but so much of the novel is the stories of the smaller characters who circle around them. And Solomon Bride, I mean, if I hadn't made that pact with myself, I think Solomon Bride would have been the place where the light would have shone in the book. And certainly they are the two people who are most like the brother and sister in The Innocents.
Right.
And they are, in many ways, innocents in the world.
And they love each other and care about each other.
Yeah. And Solemn, of course, is somebody who despises Abe because Abe has killed his father. He's also someone who has a secret that he doesn't even know. The widow recognizes in Solemn something about himself that he doesn't really know about himself yet. And the widow, being the way that she is, sees that as a vulnerability. And any vulnerability is something that she may be able to use at some point in the future. So her invitation to him to come work for her is not, as it looks on the surface, as her being a good person because they've lost their main source of support when the father's killed. It's her bringing him into her circle of influence and holding him in reserve for a moment when she will be able to use him to get what she wants.
It's so awful
Yeah.
when you think about that.
Yeah.
To take a young child who is so vulnerable on so many accounts and bring him in, and he and Bride barely see the widow. I mean, she closes herself off in her study, and there are these blackbirds and birds of other kinds brought in that the widow lets loose in the house. Tell us the significance of those birds. One
Well,
of which, oh my God, I mean, the widow takes and literally breaks its neck
yeah.
more than one.
It was very interesting to write a book in which one of the main characters, in this case, the widow, is born into a completely unjust circumstance, who is clearly remarkably intelligent and funny and is just full of grit. To have that person then be an awful person. Because the earliest readers of the first draft of this book, they all were pulling for the widow.
Really?
They all sided with the widow. And it's hard. I think that's an automatic, when you see the circumstances, it's really hard not to feel like this is an unbalanced situation. So you pull for the person who's being treated unfairly. But of course, that was not at all what I was after. I wanted by the end of the book for readers to feel like these people are completely different, but they're absolutely equal in how terrible they are. So I had to try to find ways to get a reader past their automatic sense of wanting to cheer for somebody who's been born into unfair circumstances. And one of the things that I came up with was the widow's relationship to the animal world. And as a young girl, we learn she collects animals. She collects frogs and baby birds and all those sorts of things, mostly to have as models to sketch. And some of the servants of the household kill a caribou. There's a baby caribou that won't leave its mother. So she takes that animal in, and it ends up following her around like a dog, like a trained dog. But her relationship to those animals is completely proprietary. There's no affection in those relationships. So when her animals die as a girl, she doesn't have childish funerals for them. She never names them. She feeds the frogs and the baby birds to the hunting dogs. And those birds in her adult world, in her home, are like Solemn and Vida, Solemn and Bride.
Right.
That they are creatures that she likes having around, but that she has no affection for in any way that we.
Michael, tell me about your imagination. Where does this come from? I mean, I know some writers say, oh, well, the book writes itself, it just comes to me. I can't imagine that this beautifully written book just came to you. You worked very hard to create these characters, but where did they come from in you?
I mean, in some ways, I think, Diane, they came from the world that we're living in, you know. And I was trying to imagine two people who had no compunction, um, who would do anything, and to maintain their position in the world and to get one up on the person they despise most. And you don't have to look far in the world that we're living in now to see those people. Um, and I do think that there are people, I don't think I would have said this 10 years ago, but it does seem to me that there are people who are uh, irredeemably reprehensible. And I don't know if that's a psychological condition. I don't know if it's a moral thing. I can't answer those questions, but I see them operating in the world on big political stages. But I mean, if you live long enough in the world, you'll meet them. And so it was just an attempt by me to take the worst of what I've seen uh, and to find a brother and sister, to create a brother and sister who epitomized those awful things. And it was difficult to live in that world. Also oddly entertaining. It's in some ways, everybody says that in Milton's Paradise Lost, of course, it's Satan who is the star. It's Satan who's the most is the entertainment in that poem. And there were all kinds of moments in this book where Abe's just complete lack of morality and his appetite for any kind of badness was a lot of fun to write. And I think the scenes are entertaining in and of themselves. There were all kinds of moments when the widow, because of her innate intelligence and her cunning, writing those scenes in which she has conversations where she takes people apart or turns people completely around. Those were really enjoyable to write.
One thing that couldn't have been enjoyable, maybe it was, for all I know.
I think in some ways as a writer, in some ways it's a technical challenge. Can I make this happen? Can I make this person convincing? And in that sense, there's some satisfaction in feeling like, oh yeah, that I really nailed that in that moment.
I wonder how you felt about writing the scene where Abe gives the rope, the knotted rope, to the beetle and tells him to beat Lazarus and to beat him so badly.
Mm.
How did you feel writing that?
Yeah, I mean, partly it's the question you have to ask yourself as a writer is, are you willing to look at it? And I guess as a reader as well, and as a consumer of news. I mean, if you are you willing to look at what's happening in Palestine? I mean, really look at the fact that children are being starved to death right now. I think I found a couple of instances where servants were tied to a whipping post and beaten almost to death, whipped almost to death in Newfoundland. I could have left that out, but it felt to me like that was true to the time and true to what a character like Abe Strapp would want to see. And that having it in the book told us more about Abe than I could have explained in any other way. So I think that those things are awful, and they're in some ways really difficult to write, and I think really difficult to read as well. But I think it's part of the truth of those circumstances, and we can't turn away from those and be fully human. I think that part of our job in looking at the world is to keep our eyes open and to be as honest with ourselves as possible about what we're seeing.
What about the town of Mockbeggar itself? I mean, these are modest people. They struggle to make a living. Mother Nature is against them a good part of the time. The ocean is against them. The fish are against them. They struggle throughout their lives just to stay alive, to feed their families modestly. And yet, somehow, the relationship between the sister and brother, as though it were a cloud of gaseous material, spreads over and through the entire town.
Yeah.
Is that what you see happening in places around the world?
Yes, absolutely. That is what I see. I mean, I think when Donald Trump announced for presidency in 2016, most people laughed at him, and rightly so, I think. But what we've seen since then is the complete takeover of the Republican Party by Donald Trump and by MAGA. So there are no Republican conservatives in the Republican Party anymore. It's been completely overtaken. When you look at a country like Russia, in which someone like Putin was elected and spoke very, like early on in his presidency, spoke positively about NATO and about the relationship between Russia and NATO. And then he completely took over the political world in the country, the economic world, the judicial world in Russia. So basically, it's now a dictatorship in which no opposition is allowed. And that was kind of like a gaseous, poisonous cloud that one by one went through all of the institutions that could have been in opposition. In a community as small as Mockbeggar, in a world like Newfoundland at the time, as you say, people, to say it was subsistence overstates, I think, what it was to try and make a living, to keep body and bones together. So in that circumstance, the people with all the power were the merchants in the communities.
Yes.
So ultimately, you were forced to align yourself with one or the other. Without the merchants providing equipment and food on credit in the spring and then buying your fish in the fall, you starve to death. So the people in Mockbeggar, in a world where the only choices are bad ones, end up making bad choices, which I think does poison the entire community by the end of the book.
Here is a question from Barbara. Given this story, what pitfalls are the citizenry to be especially mindful of in the events leading up to the November elections?
Well, I mean, I'm Canadian, first of all, so I want to be wary of offering advice to citizens in another country. But I think I will repeat what I said, that I think a lot of our elections in the next little while are not going to be about policy, or they shouldn't be about policy. I think that there are elections about whether or not democratic institutions will hold, and about whether there will continue to be free and fair elections. And I think that that's the question everybody should be asking of the person they're voting for. Does this person believe in democracy, first of all? Does this person support the institutions which have allowed the republic to be a republic for 250 years? If not, they shouldn't be hired to be a commentator on a news network, first of all. And they certainly shouldn't get your vote. It does feel like it's coming down to a choice as stark as that.
And in Canada?
Again, I feel like it's we're not as far along on that road, but we're a lot further along. Canadians are a bit smug, I think, about the difference between Canada and the United States. And we're clearly not as far down the road of disinformation and a distrust of the institutions that make our society possible. But we are well on that road. The premier of Alberta now she would fit right in the Republican Party in Texas. Pierre Poilievre, who's the head of the Conservative Party nationally, talks about fake news all the time. Anything reported that he doesn't like is fake news. And we are moving in exactly the same direction. And I think we have to ask those same questions. I mean, right now, the Conservative Party has a huge lead in the polls. It looks like they would be a majority government by miles. And it's because people are unhappy with the current government. But I think what we should be asking is, what are you getting out of this? Like, if you vote the other way in this election, what does this person stand for? Other than being against the government that's currently there. He doesn't seem to stand for much except getting into power.
Michael Crummey, I want to thank you so much for being with us today. Your book is absolutely fascinating, and I want to repeat, beautifully written.
Thank you, Diane.
And I'm going to go back and read The Innocents now. Thank you for being with us, and good luck.
Thank you. It's my pleasure. I really appreciate the invitation. Thank you.
And thanks to all of you. The next book club meeting will be on Wednesday, April 24th, and it's at a different time. It's going to be at 6 p.m. Eastern. Our April book is Walk Through Fire. It's a memoir by Sheila Johnson, co-founder of BET and the first female African-American billionaire. Before you go, please do take a minute to fill out a short survey about this event. It's going to pop up on the screen. Please do fill it out. Our book club is produced by Allison Brody. Allie Dickman is our events director. Our engineer today is Kennedy Wright. And of course, we couldn't have been with you today without support from Leslie Van Sant, Carly Cloud, Stuart Shapiro, Brenda Silva, and Michelle Morgan. A very special thanks to all of them and to you. I hope to see you again next month.